You may wonder who cares about the dollar. Well, for starters, you and I just might. That's because our purchasing power is at risk as the dollar loses value. We see it most at the price at the pump when we pay $80 a barrel of oil, even when we're lingering with recession. But it's not just us that worry about the dollar. India is the most recent central bank that has moved from talking to action. India acquired 200 tons of gold that the IMF sold. They paid market prices for it. There were other contenders. China has been considering to buy it, and they might buy the other 200 tons of gold that the IMF considers selling. China had entered a lowball bid thinking they could buy it at a discount. It's becoming clear now that central banks are beyond the phase of cautioning the US about pursuing sounder monetary policy, but are acting and are actively diversifying out of the dollar. The Europeans are also concerned about a stronger currency because the exports, just like from any other country, are less competitive when the currency is very strong. Having said that, the Europeans have long prepared for that and have shifted their goods and services they produce at what we call as the higher end of the value chain, where you have more pricing power, to luxury goods and complex machinery. The European Central Bank has been one of the leaders in calling for the US to return to a path of sound monetary policy. And while they cannot explicitly criticize the foreign central banks, they've been stressing the advantages of the European monetary policy over that in the US, and some may think that the Europeans have all kinds of problems on their own, but at the same time, as far as the currency is concerned, the European approach is far less inflationary. At the same time, on the fiscal side, European governments cannot spend money as easily. Amongst others, when a bank needs to be bailed out, it has to come from a regional government, and they simply don't have the centralized infrastructure that the US has. But let's look at the group that actually can influence the US dollar, but who seems to care less about it, and that is US policymakers. Let's look at Bernanke, the head of the Federal Reserve, who has argued that to get out of the Great Depression, one of the most effective tools was to get off the gold standard, to allow the price level to rise, as he calls it. Well, if I take away half of your purchasing power, then you have a greater incentive to work, and headline gross domestic product might just rise, and indeed the countries that went off the gold standard did recover faster from the Great Depression, at the cost, though, of the savers. That's, by the way, precisely the reason why the Eurozone may perform better than many think, because they are not interested in destroying their currency. At the Federal Reserve, we believe that Bernanke wants to have inflation to push home prices higher. He will never say that because the Federal Reserve can ultimately control inflation, and if they were to say they promote inflation, the cost of borrowing would skyrocket. At the same time, the weaker US dollar seems to be rather convenient for Bernanke, the head of the Federal Reserve, because he thinks that a weaker dollar will not be very inflationary, because his economists have told him that historically a weaker dollar has not always brought on inflation. I'd like to point to the spring of '08 when import prices soared over 20%. Not all of that was a surge in commodity prices. Much of that was that foreign exporters, Asian exporters in particular, could no longer absorb the higher cost of doing business with the US. Asian exporters suddenly had pricing power. There was very little we could do about it. In some ways, the credit crisis saved us from an inflationary nightmare that could have resulted. But now we're rebuilding the same sort of scenario. Another group, aside from the folks at the Federal Reserve, are our elected officials in Congress. They're pursuing policies that are driving up the deficit. Now, depending on your political persuasion, you may prefer one party or the other, but ultimately, the discretionary portion of the federal budget is becoming a smaller and smaller portion of the overall budget. Entitlement payments, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, those are the real problems down the road. And in the absence of agreement in Congress, and we very much doubt there will be an agreement on how to resolve these, odds are that we will inflate our way out of this problem. If you nominally promise pensioners is a regular payment, but in real terms, that payment is less and less, well, that's the best way of trying to fudge your way through the system. Now, Social Security, amongst others, is tied to inflation. So what better way is there than to not have inflation show up in the CPI, in the Consumer Price Inflation Index, for example, and that is the path of least resistance. If you don't want to be simply an observer, is there something you can do about it? You can take the Warren Buffett approach. He's selling his dollar cash hoard to buy railroads. He thinks railroads will be a better investment than holding cash. Now, the most obvious answer is to do what the central banks in general are doing, which is to diversify to a basket of currencies with your reserves. And for investors, obviously, it's with your investments. To consider that as an option, buying stock, securities, and whatever it may be is one option, but there is a certain portion that governments are allocating to reserve management, and they don't allocate it all to one currency, they're deploying it to baskets of currencies. That is something that investors may want to consider. We are the manager of the Merk Hard and Asian Currency Funds, also of the Absolute Return Currency Fund. Please look at our website for more information on those funds. And please also have a note that I just wrote a book, Sustainable Wealth, Achieve Financial Security in a World of Debt and Consumption. Have a look at our website and read the book, and I look forward to seeing you again here on a future YouTube video.